Chapter 3. The Northern Road. For the first time in 25 years, the Southern Royal Coach was rolling north again. It was not a procession. Marius had forbidden banners, trumpets, and the sort of pageantry that turns travel into theatre. The coach itself was new, plain, sturdy, well sprung, and painted the colour of weathered stone so it would not catch the eye of anyone looking for royalty to rob or flatter. The horses were good without being showy. The guards wore leather, not plate, and kept their swords where hands could reach them without making a sermon of it. For Marius and Elisa, this was the second time they had made this journey. The first had been different, a gamble dressed up fancy as diplomacy. This time they travelled with new company and old grief, heading toward goodbyes they could not postpone and a trial they could not avoid. Raina had joined them at High Pass, leaving the black and the blue behind to sulk and finish the building of their new forest home. The three who had travelled together before, Raina, Marius, and Riff, settled into the quiet organisation that long roads demand. Marius kept the ledgers and managed the coin. Riff handled the guards and the horses with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not trust other people's knots. Raina scouted ahead when the sky was willing and flew lazy circles overhead when it was not, her gold catching the light in ways that made farmers stop their work and point. Elisa and Marius found themselves designated babysitters for the little princess. Sienna, now 4 and as happy as a child with wind at her command and no bedtime in sight could be, took to the role of most important passenger with the seriousness only small children can muster. She explained to the horses why they were doing a good job. She told the clouds they were shaped incorrectly. She informed a very patient Marius that his beard was lumpy but acceptable. Eliza found the girl delightful. It was Sienna's joy at being taken high up on the shoulders of a dragon that made both her parents look sharply upward. The first time it happened, Marius had been mid-sentence about something kingly and unbearably dull when Sienna's laughter, bright and unrestrained, cut through the air like a bell coming from a very unexpected direction. He looked up to see his daughter strapped to Marius's back with a single loop of rope, small hands fisted in his shirt, shrieking with delight as the green dragon banked lazily over the road. Marius's face went through several weather patterns at once, and a small cloud born of irritation and fear for his precious daughter tried to gather itself above his head. "Absolutely not," he began. Riff touched his hand quietly. The gesture was small, deliberate, and carried the weight of every argument she had ever won by not making it. He stopped and the cloud dispersed. She turned to Marius, who had dismounted from Eliza's shoulders with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly how much trouble he was in and intended to get ahead of it. "I will make a harness," Riff said, as if the matter had already been settled. "A sturdy one. Buckles. Not knots. Checked twice." She looked at Marius with the expression she used when assigning tasks to soldiers who had not learnt to obey her yet. "And you should not expect that dragon-long life to be comfortable if you drop her. I will ensure you have no teeth left to eat with." Marius had the good sense to look appropriately solemn. "Understood." "Swear it." "I swear," he said, meeting her eyes. "On my honour and Elisa's, I will not drop her." Riff nodded, satisfied. She pulled a length of leather from the travel pack and began measuring it with the hands of someone who had fitted armour in worse conditions. Sienna, still on Marius's shoulders, announced that she was very brave and also hungry. Marius opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Elisa, small again and doing an excellent job at pretending she had not orchestrated the entire thing. "You planned this," he said. "I did no such thing," Elisa replied, far too innocently. "I merely observed that the child has her father's gift and her mother's lack of fear. It seemed wasteful not to let her practice. She is 4. The sooner one starts, the better," Elisa said mildly. By evening, the harness was done, double-stitched, tested with weight, and fitted so snugly that Sienna complained it was too tight for bouncing. "You will not bounce," Riff said. "But I want to." "No." Sienna considered this with the gravity of a general weighing tactical options. Then she sighed with the drama of the outvoted. "Fine, but Grandma has to do a loop." Marius made a strangled noise and forbade it. Elisa rushed to correct her title to Auntie instead. She did not feel old enough to be called Grandma, despite being nearly 400 years old. Alaris grinned. The sound of a joyful child in the skies became a tradition. They made camp that night in a clearing where the road bent and the trees stepped back as if offering hospitality. The fire was built with the competence of people who had done this before, and the watch was set without needing to be argued over. Sienna had been fed, strapped into her bedroll, and told 3 times that no, she could not practice wind indoors because tents had opinions about being turned inside out. She had fallen asleep mid-protest, one hand still curled around a stick she had been using to conduct the breeze. The adults sat close to the fire, not for warmth but for the old comfort of flame and shadow. "What should we expect?" Marius asked, directing the question mostly at Alaris, who had been raised in the north and knew its rhythms better than any of them. Alaris poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the dark. "A king trial is not a tournament," he said. "It is not about who can swing a sword the hardest or whose bloodline reaches farthest back. It is about competence." He leaned back, settling into the tone of a man explaining old rules to people who would need them. "It is a series of tasks, practical ones, judged by many voices, the current ruler, the head priest, the chief healer, and the head of the Merchants' Guild. And every single one of the contestants." Riff raised an eyebrow. "The contestants judge each other?" "Yes," Alaris said. "After every round a tally is taken. Not just from the 4, but from the competitors themselves. They vote on who is unfit. It continues until only 2 are left." "And then?" Marius asked. "A public hearing," Alaris said. "The last 2 contestants answer questions. From anyone. Lord, commoner, priest, merchant, anyone who chooses to pose them. It goes on until agreement is reached." "Agreement?" Raina asked, frowning. "Not a vote?" "Not a vote," Alaris confirmed. "Consensus. The only opinion that does not count at that point is the future king's." Marius blinked. "What?" "You may think yourself unworthy," Alaris said, looking at him steadily. "You may think yourself unable. You may argue until your voice is gone. But if your peers, nobles, commons, and competitors alike say you are fit, you take the job. It is a duty. You do not get to refuse." Elisa snorted softly. "Not exactly accommodating or respectful." "No," Alaris agreed, "but preferable to a bloody civil war. The North learned that lesson the hard way." Marius was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he said very carefully, "I have no interest in a second kingdom." "Some of your southern courtiers hope otherwise," Rife observed. "Some of my southern court," Marius said dryly, "believe that empires are built by men with ambition. They forget the men who actually have to run them. One kingdom is enough work." "But you do not mind," Riff said, "having a say in who will be across the table from you negotiating treaties?" Marius smiled, brief and sharp. "Not at all." Raina stretched in the firelight. "Then you will compete honestly and lose with grace." "Or win with reluctance," Elisa added, amused. "Either way," Alaris said, "it will not be boring." The fire crackled. Overhead, stars made their quiet arguments with clouds. In the tent, Sienna turned over, muttered something about "hire Auntie Elisa," and went still again. Alaris told him then of the other end of Elisa's prophecy, the one his choice had erased. In that future, North and South had been joined with vengeance, and neither Raina nor him existed. It was a dark tale, one of the costs of a rejected mate bond and making empires. Marius nodded and looked at the road ahead, then at the people around him. "We will find a good way," he said. "We always do," Riff agreed. And the night, which had heard worse plans, kept its peace. They arrived at Redder House 3 days later, the coach rolling up the familiar drive with the kind of relief that comes from reaching a place where you do not have to pretend. Lady Lyanna was waiting at the door. She was old now, older than memory wanted to allow, but still carried herself with the upright grace of a woman who had spent her life managing estates, sons, and the occasional dragon without losing her composure. She leaned on a walking stick, but the stick looked more like a scepter than a crutch, and her eyes were as sharp as they had ever been. Sienna, who had been released from the coach and told to be polite, took one look at the woman and declared, "You are my granny." Lyanna blinked. Then she smiled, slow and genuine. "I suppose I am." "You are the second best thing in the world," Sienna announced. "Second best?" Lyanna asked, amused. "After a dragon doing an overhead loop," Sienna said seriously. Marius looked sharply at Elisa and Alaris, who were doing an excellent job of pretending they had not heard. Lyanna laughed, a sound like old silver being polished, and held out her hand. "Come then, child. Let us see if we can find you something sweet to make up for being second best." Sienna took her hand without hesitation, and the two of them disappeared into the house, trailing conversation about whether bees were as clever as wind and why bread rose when it could stay flat. Riffa watched them go, then turned to Marius. "Your daughter has claimed another grandmother." "She collects them," Marius said, half fond, half resigned. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and herbs and the warmth that comes from a fire that has been kept for decades without going out. Redder House had not changed, still sturdy, still honest, still the sort of place where work was done without needing to announce itself. Lord Redder was in the sitting room. He had been moved there in his wheelchair, positioned where he could see the doorway and the window both, so that he would not miss the arrival. He was smaller than Alaris remembered, thinner, frailer, the bones closer to the surface, but his eyes were still clear, and when he saw them, his face did the thing it had always done when he was pleased. His mouth stayed level, but his eyes softened. "Alaris," he said, the name, unadorned, the way he had always said it. Alaris crossed the room and knelt so they were level. "Father." Redder's hand lifted slow but deliberate and settled on Alaris's shoulder. "You came." "Of course I came." "Good." Reader's gaze shifted to Elisa, who had followed and now stood close enough to be part of the moment without intruding on it. "And you brought the family." "All of it," Elisa said. Rhianna stepped forward. "Grandfather," she said, and leaned down to kiss his forehead. Marius came last, with Riff at his side. He did not kneel. He simply stood where Redder could see him clearly and said, "We came to say goodbye." "Good," Redder said again. "I have been waiting." For the next few hours, the house filled with the warmth that comes from having all the people you love in one place at one time. Sienna helped in the kitchen by explaining to the cook that flour was too powdery. Raina and Elisa took turns sitting with Lord Reader. Marius sat with Lady Lyanna and talked about grain roads and whether the North's mills were still using the old stone or had finally updated to the new weight-balanced wheels. Riff found Alaris in the stable checking the horses with the old habit of a man who could not stop being useful. "He is happy," she said. Alaris nodded. "He is. He has all of us here. That is all he wanted." "And you?" Alaris smiled, tired and true. "I am glad I came in time." At dinner, Lord Reader was wheeled to the head of the table, not because he could eat much, but because the table felt wrong without him there. Sienna sat on a stack of cushions to his right and told him, in great detail, about the loop Alaris had done that morning and how it had been very good but could be loopier. Redder listened with the patience of a man who had spent his life teaching children to hold swords and had learned that listening was the first lesson. When the meal was done and the fire banked, Lyanna stood and raised her cup. "To family," she said, "the ones we are born to, and the ones we build." "To family," they echoed. And the old house, which had held so many years and so many goodbyes, held this one as well, gently, without complaint, and with the quiet satisfaction of a place that knows it has done its work. Outside, the North prepared for the trial. Inside, for a little while longer, there was only warmth and laughter, and the sound of a small girl asking her honorary great-grandfather if he had ever flown on a dragon, and being disappointed to learn he had not. "We could fix that," Elisa offered. Marius put his head in his hands. Alaris grinned, and Lord Redder, for the first time in months, laughed and was tempted enough to take her up on the offer. A man was allowed to be foolish when the end of his road was already in sight. Chapter 4. The Presentation. The next day, Marius left for the opening of the trials. He wore his crown, not the ceremonial one that weighed like vanity, but the working crown, plain gold circlet hammered smooth by years of use. He rode in the official southern carriage, not because he cared for pageantry, but because some points were best made with clarity. He was a king already. He had not come to beg. The northern capital received him the way old cities receive weather, with resignation and the faint hope that it would not do anything dramatic. The streets were clean, the guards polite, and the palace, ancient, draughty, and entirely convinced of its own importance, opened its doors with the grudging hospitality of a house that does not only want guests, but knows how to manage them. The hall where contestants were to be presented was high-ceilinged and austere, built in an age when stone was cheaper than warmth and drama was considered a structural feature. Banners hung from the rafters, faded by time but still legible, the stag and pine, the crossed axes, the silver brook. A dais had been set at the far end, and on it sat the dying king, propped in a chair that had been built to hold men larger than he was now. Beside him stood the 3 judges, the head priest, solemn and smelling faintly of incense, the chief healer, sharp-eyed and sceptical, the head of the Merchants' Guild, who looked like she had done her sums and found the whole affair expensive, and the king himself, who watched the room with the amused patience of a man who has set a trap and is waiting to see what walks into it. The hall was full, nobles and commons alike, come to see the grandchildren of their dying king stand and be measured. There was grief in the room, carefully contained. The crown prince and his wife had died only months before in a carriage accident that still felt too sudden, too cruel. Their son, barely 5 years old, was now in the care of family, too young to compete, too young to understand why his parents would not be coming home. The trial had been called because of that accident, and everyone knew it. The contestants were called forward in order. The first was already a shock. A young woman stepped onto the dais with the straight-backed confidence of someone who had come a long way to be there and did not intend to apologize for it. She was tall, dressed plainly in travel leathers that had seen honest use, and her hair was braided back in the severe northern style that said, "I do not have time for nonsense." "Yenna of the deep north," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "granddaughter of King Torvin through my father, Prince Hallan, who married north into my mother's house." A murmur went through the hall. She met it without flinching. "Our house only has girls," she said simply, "and the trials are one way a woman can be king, so here I am." It was true. The trial rules, written in an age when precision mattered less than tradition, had never specified that contestants must be men. The North had always considered that anything not explicitly forbidden in right was allowed. Yenna's great-grandmother had been king of the North in precisely this manner, had won a trial, taken the crown, and ruled for 30 years with the kind of competence that made people forget to argue about her sex. She reminded a persistent nobleman that she was the king by knocking him senseless with a ledger as he insisted on calling her his queen. It was even made into a song that was often still sung. The man's insistence turned out to be, as she went to apologize for losing her temper, an attempt at courting her. The song went on to tell that she married the nobleman as her consort, and thus the insistent man had become the current king's father. Yenna's father had died years ago in the deep north, where winters were long and grief was kept private. She had come south alone, and she stood now beside the king's chair with her shoulders square and her chin level. The second contestant strutted to the stage like he had already won. The Duke of Halshallow was everything Yenna was not. Pompous, vain, draped in enough velvet and jewellery to fund a grain road, and so convinced of his own importance that the air around him seemed to thicken with entitlement. "Duke Corwin of Haleshallow," he announced, voice carrying like a pronouncement, "grandson of King Torvin through my father, Prince Aldric." He did not mention that his father was frail, sickly, and had not left his estates in years. He did not need to. Everyone knew. The Duke had been ruling in his father's name even before he came of age, and was officially handed the title. He had long grown accustomed to the weight of authority without the inconvenience of earning it. He stood next to Yenna with obvious disdain, as if proximity to plain leather might diminish the shine of his brocade. Yenna did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward, her face the neutral mask of someone who has learned that men like this are best ignored until they require correction. The third face looked familiar to Marius, though it took a moment, and the hint of a name before the boy he had known overlapped with the man standing on the dais. Sir Antaeus of the Lakes. Marius blinked. Auntie, the boy who had once promised to marry Rife when they grew up, because she had gotten him to yield too many times in sparring. The boy who had lived at the neighbouring estate during one of those long childhood summers before the world had split them into different kingdoms and different lives. He had grown into a knight, solid, serious, wearing good armour that had been maintained with care. His face had lost its boyish softness, but the eyes were the same, steady, thoughtful, and just a little amused, as if he were in on a joke the rest of the room had not yet noticed. "Sir Antaeus of the Lakes," he said, voice even and without flourish, "grandson of King Torvin through my father, Prince Matthias, who serves now as priest in the Temple of the Northern Star." There was a weight in those words, a history everyone in the room knew. His mother had died in childbirth when Auntie was 11. His father, shattered by grief, had taken holy vows and left his son to be raised by his grandmother at the Lakes estate. The priesthood's oaths were incompatible with rule, and so Auntie had grown up dreading he might one day be called to this. He stepped into line beside the Duke with the ease of a man who knew exactly how much space he was entitled to and did not feel the need to claim more. He had sworn his oath to the crown, and if this was the duty the crown demanded, he would do it. Then it was Marius's turn. He stepped forward, and the room went quiet in the way rooms do when everyone has an opinion and no one is certain it is safe to voice it yet. "Marius of the South," he said, "grandson of King Torvin through my mother, Princess Annlena of the North, now Queen Dowager of the South." A ripple of murmurs. He stepped into line beside Auntie, who looked at him with barely contained glee. The king surveyed his grandchildren, all 4 of them standing in a row like a problem he had set, and was now curious to see solved. "The trial will begin in 1 week," he announced, his voice still carrying despite the frailty of his body. "You will have time to settle, to prepare, and to remember that this is not a game. The North needs a king. You will prove which of you is fit to be one." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "The first trial will test competence. The second, your skill at swaying hearts. Third, endurance. After each you will be judged, not only by the 4 voices you see here, but by each other. You will decide who among you is unfit." The Duke's mouth tightened. Yenna's expression did not change. Auntie nodded once, as if the rules made sense to him. Marius simply listened. You have 1 week, the king said again. Use it wisely. When the formalities paused and the contestants were dismissed, Auntie turned to Marius with a grin that belonged to the boy he had been. 1 kingdom is not enough for you, pretty princess, he said, voice low and wickedly amused, reusing the very same insult he had used at their first meeting. Marius laughed, short, surprised, genuine. In your dreams, he shot back, 1 is bad enough. I just want to choose the one I will need to bargain with in the future. And that just might be you. Auntie's grin widened. Threatening me already. I see marriage to the little terror has not taught you manners. Marriage to Rife has taught me many things, Marius said dryly. Manners were indeed not among them. Humility was. He caught Auntie's arm as the other man turned to leave. Come to Redder House tomorrow. For dinner, Rife will want to see you. And Raina. And our daughter, who will interrogate you about whether you have ever flown on a dragon. Auntie's face lit up. I would be delighted. I will bring my wife and my ward. My eldest uncle's son is living in my house now, the Crown Prince's boy. He is still grieving. He paused. Well, you will meet him. My grandmother passed the estate to me, so we are neighbours again, after a fashion for this instant. Good, Marius said. Then we have much to catch up on. Yenna watched the exchange with interest. The obvious ease between the knight and the king, the haughty disdain of the duke who seemed to consider only Marius his competition. Rumours of the king of the south had reached even the deep north, most of them good, some of them terrifying. One thing seemed certain. The man was already a king, and not that keen on expanding his rule, curiously enough. She wondered what it would mean for the north if the last 2 standing were the arrogant duke and him. She wondered, too, where this familiarity between the knight and the king came from. By all accounts, their lives had been lived in different kingdoms, yet they spoke like men who had shared meals, disappointments, and secrets. She filed the wonder away for later discovery. The king watched his grandchildren from his chair, eyes sharp despite the frailty of his body. When the hall had emptied enough to allow for privacy, he gestured. A servant approached Marius and murmured, His Majesty requests a word. 1 king to another. Marius followed without protest. They were taken to a smaller chamber, still grand, but human-sized, with a fire that actually warmed the room and chairs that did not require a footstool to be comfortable. The old king was settled carefully, a blanket over his knees, and the servants were dismissed. For a moment neither spoke. Then the old king smiled, faint and knowing. What are your intentions, grandson? Marius did not pretend to misunderstand. To ensure that the person who sits on the northern throne is someone who does not mistake a heated argument for a declaration of war. Not to sit on it myself. The king's eyebrows rose. You are certain. I am certain, Marius said. 1 kingdom is enough work. 2 would be either farce or tragedy, and I prefer neither. The old king laughed. A dry, papery sound, but genuine. I did not expect to have a grandson from Annlena, after she bound herself to the sorcerer, he admitted. Much less a mage. A steady man and a good king on top of that is a very welcome surprise. Marius inclined his head. You have Sir Alaris of the Lakes to thank for that unusual fortune. By circumspect ways of magic and fate, I owe him my existence. The king blinked. Then he laughed again, louder this time, startled into it. Alaris? That boy who always means well, but begets chaos. If that's what he is, Marius sighed. He has not changed 1 bit since you saw him last. He strapped my daughter to his back with a bit of rope and took off with his wife like it was nothing. The king shook his head, still smiling. I sent him to fetch my runaway daughter. I expected him to drag her home by her hair if necessary, or die trying. He paused, eyes distant. It turned out nothing like I expected. It is a great blessing for all of us that it did not, Marius admitted. The king studied him for a long moment. Then he said, very softly, "You will do well here, whether you win or not." "I intend to do well," Marius said, "and then go home." "Good," the king said. "The North does not need to stop existing. It needs someone competent who will keep the roads clear and the arguments civil." He waved a hand in dismissal, tired but satisfied. "Go. Rest. The trial begins in 1 week. It will not be easy." Marius rose, bowed, not deeply, but with respect, and left the old king to his fire and his satisfaction. Outside, the palace settled into the evening. Contestants returned to their quarters. Servants lit lamps. Somewhere in the kitchens, bread was being kneaded for the work ahead. And at Reda House, a small girl asked her great-grandfather if kings were allowed to do loops, and was told, with great seriousness, that they were not, but that perhaps some rules were worth breaking.